Okay, we're on video.
Good morning. I think most people, it is your morning time. For us in Adelaide or in Brisbane, as Mike is, it's evening. So good evening, Mike, and other Australians that might have joined us online today. My name is Peter Draper. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. So I'm your moderator for tonight in this panel discussion on reforming EU rules of origin applied to trade agreements with Africa. A very technical subject, but also a very important subject in the world of free trade agreements. I recall many years ago when I first joined the South African government and we were negotiating a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we thought we were very clever for having finished off the tariff negotiations, only to discover that there were rules of origin to negotiate in their mind-numbing complexity, I would say. So what in a sense we received with one hand was taken away with the other hand through rules of origin. For the relatively uninitiated, and I'm sure Mike will get into more detail on this, rules of origin essentially are put in place to qualify access for firms that want to access the preferential benefits of the particular free trade agreement that we're talking about. And they can be very complex, and Mike will explain in more detail what that means in the context of European Union trade agreements. I'd like to introduce our panel formally. So we will kick off with Mike Humphrey, who is an independent trade expert with extensive African experience. I think he's known to many people that are joining us today. The biographies were circulated, and so to save time, I'm not going to read through them all. Mike, I'm sure you can refer to your various experiences as we proceed. And then we have two excellent discussants. We have Latifa Said Omar, who is a trainer in rules of origin at the Kenyan Customs Training School, specialized in East African community rules of origin, and now working on the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement rules of origin for Kenyan customs. And we also have Jacqueline Paimer, who is an international trade lawyer. She has 12 years experience in leading projects on African integration and a range of other topics, and most recently also on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm going to hand over to Mike. Mike, I think you've got a presentation, so when you're ready, share your screen and we can proceed. And don't forget to unmute as well.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for joining us today. I did notice that for those people who registered, there were lots of familiar people that we have worked with in the past, Lydia and I, and the Institute with our training program in Cape Town, but also some of our master's students, as well as people from other places that we haven't met. So all of you, very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. So what I'm going to do is, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. So let me just start and share screen. Okay. Let's share screen. Okay. That one. So I don't know if you can see that screen yet.
We can see it, Mike, yeah.
Okay, so I'll also just play from the start. Okay, okay, I'm assuming you can see the front page now. Okay, so so this is a presentation that's done on behalf of the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence in International Trade and Global Affairs, based at the Institute for International Trade, with the financial support of the European Union. But it is also a synthesis from a study that I did earlier this year for the GIZ, who funded that study. So this is really a synthesis from that much wider study, which is going to be published soon. I don't have a publication date for that, but possibly later this year or early next year. Okay. Okay, so what I hope to do in this presentation is to propose what can be done to change the current rules of origin that regulate the European Union's trade with Africa, to make them both more development friendly by facilitating increased African beneficiation of its primary exports, and also more supportive of Africa's continental trade ambitions. So we'll just, to reiterate some of the things that Peter was saying, I just want to briefly say, what role do rules of origin actually play in a trade agreement? So rules of origin are a set of laws, regulations, and procedures that determine which goods qualify for the preferences on offer under a specific trade agreement and which goods don't. And that was exactly what Peter discovered when he was negotiating with the European Union. It ensures that only qualifying goods produced by the parties to the agreement, i.e. those that are members of that agreement, benefit from these provisions, and it therefore prevents non-signatory countries to the agreement from benefiting from that agreement. And normally the benefits would relate to reduction in duty or even zero duty. Rules of origin are an integral part of all trade agreements, but each trade agreement has its own set of rules of origin that are unique to that agreement. So you can't assume that because your products qualify under one rules of origin, under one agreement, that they will automatically qualify under another agreement. And the rules of origin can either be agreed between the parties to a negotiated trade agreement, so free trade agreements that are negotiated all over the world would be a negotiated set of rules of origin, which are a part of those of the whole process of negotiating the trade agreement. Or alternatively, they can be determined by one of the parties. So this happens in the case where, for instance, the generalized systems of preferences, which developed countries offer to developing or least developed countries. And that is not a negotiated agreement. It is something that the preference giving country, the developed country, determines what rules will apply. Okay. So it's important for this distinction, as we'll see a bit later on in this presentation. Okay, so first I'd like to just very briefly look at the history of EU's trade relations with Africa. We'll start off in the mid-1970s with the first Lomé Convention that was signed in 1975, and after which there were 3 further extensions of the Lomé Agreement, so Lomé 2, 3, and 4, in 1979, 1984, and 1990. Under all of these Lomé agreements, the EU granted ACP, African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, non-reciprocal duty and quota-free access to the European Economic Community, which later became the European Union, for almost all products. So non-reciprocal and duty and quota-free access means that this is a one-way process. So African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, all their products enter the European market, or almost all their products. But those countries do not have to offer similar concessions to the European Union. And so this is this was a variation on the EU's GSP program. So under these Lomé agreements, there was a limited number of products that had specific quotas. These products were, for instance, bananas, beef, and sugar. So under those arrangements or protocols, bananas from ACP countries could be exported duty-free to the European Union or the EEC, but there was a quota on each year on how much each country, how many tons of bananas they could export to the European Union each year. This banana protocol was challenged at the WTO in 1997 by the United States and a number of Central American banana producers as being discriminatory against those Central American banana producers because it only applied to African, Caribbean, and Pacific LDCs and developing countries, not to Central American countries. The European Union basically lost that case at the WTO. And so the Lomé Conventions were then replaced by the Cotonou Agreement in mid-2000. As part of that process, the EU was given a special dispensation by the WTO, which gave the EU and the ACP countries up to the 31st of December 2007 to conclude WTO-compliant reciprocal trade agreements. The European Union and so because with a reciprocal trade agreement, you can discriminate. You only need, in terms of WTO law, you only need to give those concessions to the countries that sign up to your free trade agreement. You do not have to give it to anyone else. And so that would enable the European Union to import particular products from the Caribbean, for instance, without having to give the same concessions to Central American countries. So subsequent, after a whole period of negotiation up until the end of 2007, and actually some of them continued afterwards, the EU and mostly developing African countries, there were 4 LDCs that also signed WTO-compliant EPAs, or Economic Partnership Agreements. But most African LDCs did not sign EPAs, but they continued to benefit from duty-free and quota-free access to the European Union through the non-reciprocal Everything But Arms Agreement, which applied to all least developed countries, not just African or Caribbean or Pacific LDCs, but all LDCs. So that was fully compliant with the WTO. Under the Lomé and Cotonou agreements, ACP products were required to meet the test of product-specific rules of origin, and cumulation was allowed with any other ACP or EEC country. Okay, so the importance about that was, as I said earlier, these agreements were not reciprocal agreements, and the EU could determine what the rules of origin would be that would apply to that. So, but the important point is that cumulation was allowed with any other ACP country, and also obviously with any EEC or EU country as well. So that meant that African countries could cumulate from other African countries, or also from other countries in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. Okay, so let's just quickly have a look at what cumulation means. Cumulation allows producers to import inputs from other countries that are contracting parties to a trade agreement, and count these inputs as if they had originated in their own country. We're going to look at two kinds of cumulation: bilateral cumulation and diagonal cumulation. So bilateral cumulation allows any of the parties to an agreement to cumulate with each other. Sorry, my telephone. To accumulate with each other. So for instance, under the Cotonou Agreement, a Ghanaian company could import inputs from Germany and count these imported inputs as if they were Ghanaian inputs, and then produce their final product and then export their final product back to Germany. And so that is bilateral cumulation, bi meaning two, where the two of the parties to the agreement import inputs, count them as if they came from their own country, and then export the final product, in that case, to Germany. The second kind of cumulation is diagonal cumulation. And this is intended to promote regional trade and cooperation among members of a regional grouping by allowing exporting countries to count inputs originating from any other contracting party in their region, as if these inputs originated in their own country. So this would allow, therefore, African countries to import inputs from any other African country. In the case of the Lomé and Cotonou agreements, also from any country in the Caribbean or any Pacific island country. So all of those inputs would count as originating in the country of the final exporter. Okay, I hope that wasn't too technical. All right, so now I'd like to look at the evolution of EU-African trade relations. Continue with that by looking at what happened with cumulation. So unfortunately, the rules that apply after 2007, so after the Cotonou Agreement ended, so there now is a situation where there are a number of different African Economic Partnership Agreements, 5 of them actually in total. And then also the LDCs that did not sign these reciprocal EPA agreements then had EBA, which had its own rules of origin and also did not allow accumulation with other countries. So this, if you remember, is very different to the situation under Cotonou or Lomé, where African countries could accumulate with any other African country. For accumulation to be allowed with countries in different economic partnership agreements or between African everything but arms qualifying countries, specific approval needs to be applied for and granted by the European Union. And that's done virtually on a product by product basis. The usual EU rule is that accumulation is only allowed for products where rules of origin are exactly the same. So in a number of these African EPAs, the rules of origin were the same, but in each of the regions, there were some of the rules that were different. And so the EU would normally grant this specific approval for accumulation where the rules are exactly the same, but not where the rules are different. With respect to the African EBA countries, so under everything but arms, most non-African LDCs can accumulate with other LDCs in their regional groupings. But surprisingly, African LDCs cannot accumulate with LDCs in Africa. Okay, so we will look at that again a bit later. So that's the relationship between Europe and Africa. Now I'd like to just have a very quick examination of what happened with respect to African intra-African trade. So at the time of their independence, most African governments believed that promoting, most African governments were in a situation where they were basically exporters of raw materials, mainly to their former colonial power. So they had a period when they decided that they needed, in order to increase employment, increase value added, the worth of their raw materials, and to expand their export opportunities, they needed to develop domestic production of various value-added products. And so a number of African countries then introduced highly protective programs where duties were increased on competing imports. That didn't really work for many countries because often their domestic market was too small, or where there was local production, those products that were produced were not competitive by price or often by quality internationally. And so after a period of probably a couple of decades, most African governments then began to believe that promoting regional trade and regional economic integration is actually the best option for them for reducing poverty and their dependence on the export of raw materials to developed countries. This resulted in a plethora of regional trade agreements and regional integration initiatives throughout Africa, with many countries joining a number of these simultaneously. These include CIMAC, COMESA, EAC, ECOWAS, SACU, SADC, and various attempts to include North African countries such as the African Maghreb Union and CENSAD. A common feature of all of these RTAs is that they allow accumulation between their member states, but not between the regions, but between the members of those trade agreements. So despite these attempts, though, at creating regional markets, intra-African trade has not grown substantially. Most African countries remain exporters of unprocessed or semi-processed primary commodities to the European Union and to the rest of the world. At the Africa-wide level, the Organization of African Unity, which later became the African Union, launched various attempts to create an Africa-wide market. The first of these was the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, aiming at creating a single Africa-wide market by 2000. But by the mid-90s, it was clear that those targets were not going to be reached. And so this plan was superseded by the Abuja Treaty in 1994, which envisaged the creation of an African Economic Community by 2028. As part of this initiative to create the African Economic Community, the AU launched the African Continental Free Trade Agreement negotiations in mid-2015, which would be a first step towards creating an African Economic Community. So after a period of negotiations, and despite the fact that not all the elements of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, had been concluded, the AU decided to activate the AfCFTA with effect from the 1st of January 2021, allowing trading under those provisions that had been agreed. And the agreed provisions also included accumulation with any other African CFTA country. At that time, all AU member countries, except for Eritrea, had signed the agreement, and 41 had ratified it. Subsequently, a further 3 countries have ratified the agreement, bringing the total number to 44 of the 54 African Union member states. So now, after all of that, we can finally get around to the issue that I raised at the start of the presentation. What can be done to change the multiplicity of rules of origin that currently regulate the EU's trade with Africa, to make them more development friendly by facilitating increased African beneficiation of its exports, and also more supportive of Africa's continental trade ambitions? So what I'm proposing is that African exporters to the European Union should be allowed to accumulate with any other African country and with EU countries. So that was similar to the situation that prevailed under the Lomé and Cotonou Agreement, except that it also now would have to include the North African countries, which were never a part of the ACP grouping. However, this is not an easy or quick fix solution, as implementing this proposal will require, firstly, that the rules of origin of the 5 African EPAs would need to be standardized. And this will involve negotiations with the separate EPA regional signatories to agree on, firstly, a single rule for each of the products that currently have different rules of origin in the different EPAs. And then secondly, any other rules of origin or rule of origin that either side would wish to amend for other products. Because the problem with opening up renegotiating any trade agreement is that means that any partner, so not just the EU in this situation. So the EU would come to the table and say, we would like to amend all these certain numbers of rules of origin to bring them in line so that we can have an Africa-wide rule of origin. But that would also mean that the other signatories can also amend, can also bring up amendments which they might want. So that could be a very long process. The second thing that would be needed is that the rules of origin for the Everything But Arms agreement would need to be revised in line with this EPA rules of origin that would have been standardized, allowing African LDCs to accumulate with each other as a group, and also to enable them to accumulate with the EPA countries. All LDCs would benefit from this, because if they changed the Everything But Arms agreement, that would apply to all LDCs, not just African LDCs. However, the EU could apply to the WTO for a waiver, like the US has for AGOA. So with AGOA, they have a special waiver that enables them to grant concessions only to African countries. So with that precedent, the EU could apply for that as well, but that can be rejected by other WTO members. And then finally, they would also need to standardize the rules of origin for the North African countries to bring those in line with the revised African EPA rules of origin. So all of those 3 processes will be very complicated and possibly take quite a lot of time. If this proposal was implemented in full, the African market would be much more attractive for existing and potential African and EU investors in value-added production for export to the European Union, because it would enable them to take advantage of accumulation and to source inputs from various countries, So if you were investing in some product that is an input into another production process, by having a single set of rules of origin across Africa and accumulation being allowed, that would also make it interesting for you to invest in African countries in order to supply other African countries with inputs. So this is rather like what happens in Southeast Asia in ASEAN, where lots of ASEAN regional trade is actually between multinational companies importing components from other ASEAN countries. All right, however, as another warning, apart from how difficult this process could be, is that on their own, these reforms, simply changing the rules of origin and allowing accumulation, will facilitate investment in these value-added processes, but they won't guarantee that that investment will actually eventuate. For that to happen, there's need to simultaneously address other challenges constraining investment in African value-added production. These challenges vary, obviously, from country to country, but include inconsistent investment incentive and macroeconomic policies, infrastructural deficiencies, and lack of transparent and functioning legal systems. So you will be pleased to know that I've now come to the end. So thank you very much. Asante sana, tatenda. Okay, so thank you, Peter.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. Can you stop sharing your screen now so we can see our discussants? And a reminder to participants to type your questions or comments into the Q&A or chat with us if you wish. So I'd like to turn to Latifa Said Omar now, who will be our first discussant. Latifa.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And thank you, Mike, for the presentation. It's good to know that the EU, when they were negotiating this agreement with the African countries, they wanted to encourage growth in the economies. But there's still some things that need to be done. Maybe there'll be need to review all this agreement, considering that maybe since 1975 until now, there's no much growth in the economy in most of those countries where we have the EPAs and IBAs, and that a way of trying to at least encourage trade between the countries in the EPAs and EBAs is through accumulation, but this has been there have been some issues concerning accumulation with other EPAs in the region and also EBAs, considering that some of those countries went ahead to negotiate or to ratify the agreement without the other members, maybe in their regional groupings. So there's need maybe to see if the EU can renegotiate the EPAs so that they collapse all of them, considering the development of the African Continental Free Trade Area, such that now, instead of having the several EPAs and EBAs, the EPA will be between the EU and the African Continental Free Trade Area, which means also the North African countries can be included. Also standardizing the rules of origin in the different EPAs. It will be going a long way, considering the African Continental Free Trade Rules of Origin on product-specific rules. So if this can be taken into account that already the product-specific rules are already there, then it's going to help encourage trade from the African countries to the EU. Also, inconsistent investment is one area that also needs to be addressed. We find that African countries have a lot of rednecks or bottlenecks, which are countries or investors in investing in those countries. So if this investment can be reviewed to encourage investors to get into the African countries and take advantage of this agreement, then it will go a long way in helping those African countries grow economically and also remove people from poverty. You can see from the African Continental Free Trade Area, we have the special economic zones and special economic arrangements are all recognized. So if this can be put into place to encourage investment, then it will go a long way in encouraging trade between the African countries and the EU. So another thing to note is that the rules of origin sometimes are presumed to be the one that is impeding trade in this trade agreement. Like Peter said earlier, that in one way, on one side, you're given tariff concession, but on the other side, there are rules of origin that you need to contend with. So if these rules of origin can be reviewed to be development friendly, or they can be made to be easily applied, then there's a way that trade can be facilitated, and also there'll be more investment that will get into the country. Another thing is that there's need also to review the agreement. Even though the EU are the ones that are giving the benefit, there's need to review the agreement to see, since 1975, we have had different agreements with African countries, but much has not been achieved. Is there a need to review this agreement? We are the ones giving the benefit, but what are the African countries take on this agreement? Maybe there's one side that we are missing on the African side. It might mean that what they want to achieve, maybe they're hesitant to trade with the EU, maybe considering most of those exports to the EU are either raw materials or unprocessed goods or semi-processed. So there'll be need to review the agreement between the EU, and if they are going to incorporate the whole of Africa under the African Continental Free Trade Area, to see if this agreement can be reviewed so that it can achieve the intended purpose. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Latifa. I see we've got a couple of questions now in the Q&A. Keep them coming to the audience. I'll turn now to Jacqueline, who to provide her prepared remarks. Jacqueline.
Thank you, Peter, and also thank you, Mike, for your presentation. Very, as usual, very enlightening. I like the historical part of the agreements as well, because they give us a context on, the existence of the current rules of origin and how it's affecting the continent. I'd like to focus on a little bit on the AFCFTA itself. So one of the main objectives for creating the Continental Free Trade Area was because of the marginalization of the Africa's trade. So this is a dated statistics, but I think in 2018 we had as a continent 2.5% global trade share, which I think is really dismal. We can all agree. And almost 2% of that 2.5 was being accounted for by two countries, South Africa and I think the crude oil from Nigeria. So that means that the rest of the 53 countries only account for 0.5 or 0.6, whatever, % of trade, of global trade. So the AFCFTA, with the rules of origin concerned, is the goal is to add value to the exports. So it's not so much that we are not exporting or not exporting globally enough, it's the value of our exports. They're mostly raw materials. So the rules of origin at the AFCFTA will allow us, that's the plan, is that it allows local production to increase by sourcing from hopefully cheaper raw materials from each other's countries, and then increasing value and ultimately exporting higher value products, whether it's in the extractives industry, agro-processing industry, etc. So the projections that ECA has provided online show that will increase about at least over 40% for agro-processing, for example, and 20% in the extractives, which is one of the biggest exports for Africa. So when it comes to the EU, so one of the concerns with the EU rules of origin that we should look out for is that we will have, if AFCFTA is working really well, that means that we have higher value products, which as traditionally speaking, the EU was importing from Africa, mostly inputs. So if we're having finished products and the manufacturing has increased, maybe there's an interest there that the EU would want to protect, that the source of the raw materials, that is Africa, is now adding value. So that's one of the things that maybe to look out for as a pitfall when we're renegotiating. The second thing I would like to mention is that for African countries at the national level, the AFCFTA goal is an economic one. So we want to plug in, to plug into the trade, intra-African trade, the SMEs, the vulnerable groups, I would say. We don't have the big number of multinational companies. Those that we have tend to also be through foreign direct investment. So at the national level, because the MSMEs or the SMEs are, and when I say MSMEs, of course, the small and medium enterprises are the biggest employers, and therefore also a very big number. It's important that that they are encouraged to be linked into the value addition chain and industrialization, in terms of creating niche markets, etc. So I think with the EPAs, with the EU agreements on rules of origin, whether it needs to be under the EPAs or everything that comes, African countries will want to renegotiate in a way that those vulnerable groups, the SMEs that are employing women and youth, bigger communities, informal cross-border traders are also dealt with under the AFCFTA at the national level to sort of streamline them into the system and get them benefits in the African trade. But that's a concern that we need to look out for when we're renegotiating the rules of origin with the European Union. Finally, I guess when Mike talks about the existing challenges, you mentioned most of them. One of the things that I experience as an African is that there's an attitude to our value addition, our value-added products, the attitude of, some of it is valid because maybe our standards are not as, of products are generally not as good as the European standards or, from the Americas. But the attitude, if you put before a consumer 3 identical products, let's say coffee, one is being produced by a final product, right? One is produced by Uganda or Kenya, the other in China, if I can even say, and then the other is produced by Switzerland. Most likely, the consumption is going to be preferred for the one produced in Switzerland, even though it's maybe $5 over the one that is produced by the Ugandan. So one of the hurdles that the rules of origin realignment and also the value addition will have to overcome is our attitudes towards our own final value-added products, so to speak. So thank you again for your proposals. I think the alignment with the EU rules of origin is very important. I can't really speak to how it can happen. I think those are strategies that the African countries have to think about and really consider, because the European Union has always been a very strong trade partner of the continent. And it will continue to be, because even though the African Continental Free Trade Area is happening, it's not a form of de-globalizing for us as a continent. It's actually to realign ourselves to be a stronger trading partner of the world. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So we've got a range of questions online, from the technical to, I guess, the strategic. I'd like to start with the technical, and a question by Pablo Aquiles. This is to Mike specifically, and it relates to diagonal accumulation. And Pablo mentions that, in his view, the EU SADC agreement does allow diagonal accumulation, as well as the EU Ghana and EU Cote d'Ivoire as well. So he's asking for clarification, Mike. Is that the case, or did he misread the agreements?
Okay, definitely, as far as I can see, it does not allow accumulation outside of your EPA group. So the EU SADC EPA does not allow accumulation specifically with another EPA group. They allow accumulation within the group, but not across the groups. And that really is the problem. It specifically says that you need to get specific approval to accumulate outside of your EPA region.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. So the next one is from Magdalene Marie-Joy, and it's about the nexus between accumulation in rules of origin and regional or global value chains, and how they both impact on facilitating exports. If you could just spell that nexus out a little bit.
Okay, so Magdalena, thank you for that. Nice to hear from you again. Okay, so that is a very valid question, because often value chains are not only regional, they are cross-continental. But what I was interested in doing in this particular exercise is looking at how we can promote more value chain production and investment within Africa. So that doesn't relate to international value chains, but it's to try and assist investment in African countries that produce inputs that would go into other African countries' processes of production. And so by allowing accumulation across Africa, that would promote African value chains, but it would not promote international value chains. But it is also a way, as Jackie was saying, of actually increasing intra-African trade, and also getting other groups that are not involved in trade at the moment involved in this process, because it would be then possible to accumulate from small companies in any African country and use their inputs into a final production process. Okay, hopefully, Magdalena, I answered your question.
So one more question for you in this round, Mike, and then I'm going to flick a couple to Latifa and Jackie respectively. So from Godwin Semiyu, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Godwin. So Godwin is interested in the issue of poor regional transport networks, and what mechanisms can you advise African countries adopt to make movement of goods more effective? So not quite about rules of origin, but maybe relate that to the rules of origin issue that we're considering.
Okay, so part of the problem why Africa's transport network is not as extensive as it possibly is in other continents is also a question of demand. And so if there's not a demand, or if a lot of countries do a lot of high value imports and low value exports, so that's very difficult for transport companies to meet the different requirements there. So a country exporting mineral products would need bulk transport, possibly using trains. or large trucks, but importing high value added products possibly is done by air. So it doesn't facilitate the creation of local freight networks. One of the arguments about allowing this accumulation would be that it at least creates the possibility of creating these regional value chains or Africa-wide value chains, which would increase demand for freight services. And then hopefully that would result in improvements in those freight routes and also facilities. So private companies would then invest in fleets of trucks or aircraft or whatever was required to transport those products. So part of the advantage of the accumulation process is that it would also assist with improving the possibilities for regional, much more in-depth regional transport networks. Okay.
Great. This one I will pass to Latifa. So just to forewarn Latifa. And this comes from Lulade Berhanu, who asks, what would renegotiations of EPAs on the basis of the AFCFTAs and not the individual EPA groups, what would it look like? And can we actually envisage such a scenario? Would the EU, for instance, negotiate with, I presume, the AFCFTA Secretariat as opposed to who? It's not clear. So Latifa, over to you.
Okay, I think if the EU can be able to consider renegotiating all the EPAs into one with the African Continental Free Trade Area, then there's more to be achieved than the individual EPAs, considering countries cannot accumulate with the different EPAs that they are not member in. So I think this renegotiation of the whole agreement will mean that the rules of origin will need to be reviewed. So considering most of those rules of origin are product-specific rules, and the African Continental Free Trade Area rules of origin are also product-specific rules, then it, at least there is a basis whereby the rules of origin will not be redesigned. The product-specific rules are there. The only thing is having South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria to back this agreement, then I think we'll move more places. Considering the African Continental Free Trade Area, everyone's eye on South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria to give it a push. So if these three countries are going to be actively incorporated in reviewing the agreement between the EU and the African Continental, then this agreement will move places, considering the African Continental Free Trade Area has already started to trade under the Guided Trade Initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Latifa. Before you go, just a question of my own. So presumably, as you realign rules of origin across the continent under this scenario, you would also have to realign tariff rates that correspond to the rules of origin and the individual products. But the AFCFTA is not a customs union, it's a collection of free trade agreements and LDCs in individual member states. So how would that process work? It's potentially very complex, and Mike might want to think about answering that question as well. Yeah.
I'll try to answer it. One way to try to see if all the members in the AFCFTA will be benefiting under the product-specific rules is if we are able to just use the FOB value instead of the cost, insurance, and freight. So the raw materials that may be sourced from either within the continent, or if they're going to be sourced outside the continent, which means we look at the material content of those non-originating material or under the value addition, then it means that we need to only take the FOB value of the goods instead of taking the cost, insurance, and freight. So this will help us having those goods originate, because we have taken the price of the goods from the source outside the continent instead of taking or considering also the transport from the source.
Okay, thanks, Latifa. Mike, quick response on that?
Okay, so basically, in an FTA, there is no necessarily there is no requirement to have a common tariff, and so actually the rules of origin do not affect the decisions of individual countries with respect to what they charge for particular products. So actually just realigning the rules of origin does not necessarily have any impact for revenue, except where it enables easier imports. Maybe that would result in possibly more revenue. But the revenue and rules of origin reforms are two separate processes of negotiation. But I'd also just like to comment on this whole thing about Africa negotiating as a whole with Europe. So basically that is an idea that has also got some traction in Europe, the idea of having a continent-to-continent free trade agreement. So that's a more radical proposal than what I'm actually proposing, which is to leave the existing agreements in place and simply align the rules of origin to allow accumulation. If we look at the possibility of a Africa to Europe FTA negotiation, then the whole issue of reciprocity again comes up. And that's exactly why many LDCs in Africa did not sign the EPAs, because they did not want to reciprocate. They did not want to give the same duty-free access to European products into their market as they were granting, as they were granted by the European Union. And that's why they opted not to sign EPAs. So for instance, in the EAC, only Kenya signed an EPA. The other LDC members of the EEC did not, East African Community did not sign an EPA because they did not want to grant reciprocity to the European Union. So if there was a continent-to-continent FTA, that all of the African countries would have to agree that they would grant reciprocity to Europe. And that would be probably even more difficult than just changing the rules of origin.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Jackie, so next one goes to you. So this is from Muriuku Alice, and it's a simple one. Does the African Union Commission have a strategy for spurring value addition in Africa?
Not the African Union Commission per se, because the AfCFTA, while it's an agreement that it's formed by the state parties, it has to be implemented at the national level. And that's why I kept referring to the priorities at the national level to encourage value addition. So the goal of the rules of origin that are being negotiated in Accra is to encourage, and one of the things, maybe I will bring it up, one of the two products under which the rules of origin have not been finalized is textiles and what is it, automotives. And it's a bit worrying because for the textiles industry, the vulnerable groups that I'm speaking about, the women, the SMEs, that's a very important sector for them. And so the conflicting interests of the vulnerable groups and then the big textile industries is the reason as to why it's taking a little bit longer for that rules of origin to be finalized. Because for a lot of the countries, the rules of origin will ensure that they're small. You know, as an example, a seamstress in Uganda, not producing at large scale like Woolworths, for example, or a South African company, can also benefit from that rule of origin on the African continent and export under the AfCFTA. So at the national level, is where the countries need to make sure that the value chains and value addition is happening, both in goods and services. But for the goods, it's important to highlight that when the rules of origins that are being developed are agreed to. That's why it's important to be reflected. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie. One more for you, putting on partly your trade lawyer's hat, but also your, I guess, trade politics hat. So it was posed to Mike. It comes from David and Busuri, but I'm going to pose it to you for the reasons just stated. So what could be some of the possible reasons for WTO members to reject the EU applying for, he says, something similar, by which he means a waiver for LDCs, similar to the AGOA waiver. So why, if the EU went that route, why would certain members in the WTO oppose that?
I mean, for the simple fact that the rules of the WTO for multilateralism ensure, one, for the fact that it has to be reciprocal, or to just form a regional integration, or I mean, not a regional, a REC between, an agreement between Europe and Africa, so to speak. Which I think if we're doing that, then that's an FTA. Maybe they wouldn't reject that, but it has to be reciprocal because of the rules under the WTO. That if it's a regional integration, it's an exception to the rule of non-discrimination. Yes, I mean, off the top of my head, that's how I could think about it. But Mike, since it was yours, maybe you might want to add on.
Well, just before Mike comes in, so we are running out of time, I'm going to ask our panelists to make concluding remarks. And Mike, you were welcome to pick that up as well. I would also just observe there's a lot of questions still in the Q&A that are not answered. I'm afraid time constraints, we're not going to get to all of them, but thank you all for posing them. So Mike, concluding comments, and then I'll circle back through the panel.
Well, I think it's been really great. We've had some really interesting questions, and that's been really very good. I think also that we should not underestimate what actually revising, even if we were to opt for the very simple process of accepting the existing arrangements, but trying to get this unified rules of origin, we should also not underestimate the complexity and time that something like that's going to take. It's not an easy solution. So I think there I'd like to stop.
It was short and sweet. Well, thanks very much, Mike. Latifa?
I'll just borrow from what Mike has said. So renegotiating the agreement may mean that having reciprocity between the EU and the AfCFTA. So the easier way is maybe to see how accumulation amongst those EPAs, existing EPAs and ABAs can be allowed. So that's my concluding remarks. Thank you.
Gosh, our panel all being very disciplined. Jackie, last but by no means least.
Thank you. Because the AfCFTA has used the RECs, the existing RECs, as building blocks. So one of the things that I had written it down, but I didn't mention it, was that maybe the possibility would be to realign according to the regional integration communities, because they're still existing under the AfCFTA, they're still being recognized, and maybe, and for most of the African countries under the AfCFTA, they belong to a specific REC. So that could be another avenue for renegotiating or realigning the EPAs and the EU's rules of origin with Africa. But thank you very much. This has been a really meaningful discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Jackie. And on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to express my thanks to the entire panel, and of course to our audience for participating so actively. I felt we could have continued for some time to come, and we were really just getting warmed up, but watch this space. We will publish this recording to our website, and Mike will shortly release an opinion editorial, so a short condensed version of his argument. And of course, the report itself will be out soon as well, and that will be published by the GRZ itself, I believe. Mike, any final thoughts from your side before we sign out?
No, I think it was very good, and I'm very impressed that, Peter, you think there's even more to say about rules of origin, because my wife always warns me that if I'm ever asked what I'm doing at a dinner party, I should never start talking about rules of origin, because then you just see the rest of the people at the dinner party, their eyes just sort of cloud over. So rules of origin is very technical, it is very specialist, but all of you, I hope, who've participated, consider yourselves to be rules of origin experts. I did ask one of Latifer's training courses that I was asked to do a speech, a guest lecture at, so I did a presentation on rules of origin from the point of view of a trade negotiator, because all of them were customs officials. And at the end of that, I asked whether any of the group, they were all new trainees, were about to be employed by the customs authority in Kenya. I asked them if any of them now, on the basis of this lecture that I've just given on rules of origin, would like to change and no longer become customs officials, but become trade policy officials. And unfortunately, not one of them put their hands up.
So you sold them then, Mike. All righty, on that note, let's conclude tonight's or this morning's proceedings. Thank you very much for participating, and good night, good morning.
Good morning.